Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into some pretty wild stuff today. Really a geopolitical story that's unfolding right in front of us. Seems like the Ukraine war might be coming to a close, and the future of NATO expansion is totally up in the air.
Yeah, it's changing so fast, and the consequences could be huge.
Okay, so the Trump administration is taking the lead on negotiating the end of the war in Ukraine, but what's interesting is that Ukraine doesn't seem to be involved in the talks at all.
That's right. And it is interesting, especially considering how much Ukraine has relied on NATO for military support this whole time, especially, the U.S.
And here's where it gets even more complex. The White House has said that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, which is a major concern that Russia's had since the beginning.
Exactly. I mean, Russia's whole reasoning for invading Ukraine in the first place was this anxiety about NATO expansion, that Ukraine would become this launching pad for missiles right at Russia's doorstep. That fear was a huge driver in their actions.
But even without that declaration from the White House, Ukraine wouldn't be eligible to join NATO right now, right?
Correct. The NATO Charter has this rule, Article 5, that says countries with ongoing territorial disputes can't join.
So it seems like Ukraine losing some territory is pretty much a done deal in these negotiations. We're potentially talking about Ukraine giving up a big chunk of its land, maybe even 20% to Russia.
It's a lot to lose, and it really shows the power dynamics at play here. I mean, from a purely military standpoint, it looks like Russia has achieved what it set out to do.
To add to that, it looks like President Trump and Vladimir Putin had a 90-minute phone call and agreed to meet in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to, well, hammer out the details of how the war will officially end.
And there might be even more to it. They're talking about 2 more summits, one in Russia and one in the U.S. after that meeting in Riyadh.
Wow. Sounds like they're going for a full-blown agreement that could really change the whole geopolitical landscape. And there's another layer to this, right? President Trump even hinted that Ukraine might eventually become part of Russia.
Yeah, you can't ignore that. It's something Russian nationalists have wanted for a long time. And it really speaks to the feeling, at least from Russia's perspective, that they've won this war. They've beaten Ukraine and, in a way, defeated NATO itself. At least that's how they see it, and maybe even how a lot of the world sees it.
That's a pretty grim outcome for Ukraine. So what options do they even have at this point?
Well, they're facing the possibility of total defeat on the battlefield. So a negotiated settlement, even one that involves giving up land, might be the less terrible option.
Yeah, it's a tough choice, but strategically, I get it.
And this brings us to another really important part of this whole situation. What about the future of NATO?
That's where things get interesting for the rest of the world. It seems like the U.S. might be rethinking its commitment to the whole alliance. What's going on there?
Well, the U.S. Secretary of Defense has been pushing European nations to step up their own defense efforts, which kind of implies that the U.S. won't be as involved.
So basically, they're saying, Europe, you're on your own.
That's the message. The U.S. is shifting its focus to the Indo-Pacific region. It seems like they're leaving Europe to handle its own security.
That's a huge change, considering how much Europe has depended on the U.S. for defense for decades. This basically suggests that Article 5, the whole idea of collective defense that NATO is based on, could be put on hold. So what does this mean for NATO as a whole?
It really throws the entire future of the alliance into question.
So let me get this straight. The Ukraine war is ending, NATO expansion is likely off the table, and Europe might have to go it alone on defense. This is massive.
It's a complete shakeup of global power. It raises huge questions, like, can Europe really defend itself without the U.S.? And will this satisfy Putin, or will he just keep pushing further into Europe?
It's a lot to process. What are your thoughts?
Honestly, it's mind-blowing how fast everything has changed. We've gone from what seemed like a rock-solid NATO alliance and unwavering support for Ukraine to a negotiated end to the war with Ukraine making big concessions. And the future of NATO is hanging in the balance.
It's like watching dominoes fall. One event just sets off a chain reaction around the world. What worries you about other countries seeing this and getting bolder?
Well, history shows us, right, that whenever there's a shift in power, it creates openings for those who want to grab more influence or territory. If certain leaders see this as a weakening of the U.S.-led global order, it might tempt them to push the limits and go after their own goals, and that could destabilize different regions.
Do you see any parallels to this in history? Like, are there any specific examples that come to mind?
Oh, absolutely. You can look back at the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it left a power vacuum that led to all these ethnic conflicts and territorial disputes, especially in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The situation in Ukraine itself is actually a direct result of how the geopolitical map was redrawn after the Cold War.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even when things seem stable, they can unravel fast and lead to unexpected consequences.
Okay.
Are there any particular regions or countries you see as especially vulnerable or volatile right now because of all this?
There are a few hotspots around the world that could be affected. For example, the South China Sea is already tense, with China getting more assertive about its territorial claims. This power shift could embolden them even more.
This is definitely complicated with lots of moving parts. We've talked about Europe, about other nations getting more assertive, but what about countries that have always depended on the U.S. for protection? Are we seeing a change in how the world views American power and reliability?
Without a doubt. When the U.S. seems less committed to its allies, it can erode trust. Countries that have relied on America's security guarantees for a long time might start feeling vulnerable. And that could lead to a scramble for new alliances or a spike in military spending as countries try to beef up their own defenses, which could actually make the global security environment more unpredictable and dangerous.
So, what does all this mean for everyday people? How could these big geopolitical changes impact their lives?
Well, the potential consequences are pretty broad. Economic instability is a big one. Global trade could be disrupted if conflicts break out or if countries start adopting protectionist policies. We could also see prices for goods and services go up, maybe even job losses.
And then there's the human cost of conflict, which is always devastating to think about. Displacement, refugees, the loss of innocent lives. These are tragic realities we can't ignore.
Exactly. It's important to remember that behind all these geopolitical moves, there are real people whose lives are being directly affected.
It can feel pretty overwhelming. This deep dive has really made me realize just how interconnected the world is and how something happening in one place can ripple out and affect everyone.
It reminds us that we're all part of this global community, and the decisions made by world leaders have a huge impact on every single one of us.
So as we wrap up, is there one key takeaway, a final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed, to think critically, and to understand that the world is constantly changing. The future is uncertain, but if we can grasp the forces at work, we can navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
It really does. And it makes you think, what are the long-term consequences of all this shifting power in the world? Could it make things more unstable? Or could it actually create opportunities for new alliances and a more even distribution of power?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think both are possible. In a multipolar world, power is spread out among several major players instead of being concentrated in one place. And that could lead to more competition, maybe even conflict, if those players don't set clear rules and ways to cooperate.
So you're saying the key to making a multipolar world stable is for these new power centers to communicate effectively and actually work together.
Exactly. And that's not easy. It takes building trust, finding common ground, and recognizing that cooperation, not confrontation, is what's best for everyone in the long run.
It's a big challenge, but definitely worth striving for.
Yeah.
So where does the U.S. fit into all of this? Will it stay a dominant force, or will its influence fade as other powers rise?
The U.S. will definitely remain a major player globally, but it might have to change its approach, focusing more on diplomacy and collaboration instead of just relying on military might. That could mean strengthening existing alliances, forming new partnerships, and engaging in more multilateral diplomacy.
So basically, the U.S. needs a more subtle and strategic foreign policy if it wants to stay influential in this changing world.
That's right. It's about understanding that power in the 21st century isn't just about military dominance. It's more about building networks, working together, and finding common ground on shared challenges like climate change, economic instability, and global health.
Sounds like we're entering an era that needs a new kind of leadership, one that prioritizes diplomacy, collaboration, and acknowledges how interconnected we all are as a global community.
Absolutely. And it's not just about leaders in governments and institutions. It's also about everyday citizens having informed and productive conversations, challenging assumptions, and speaking up for a more just and sustainable world.
That's a powerful message. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in shaping the future. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Thanks again for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the complex world of global geopolitics. We hope you found it informative and interesting. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We're here to make things clear. New episodes every day.